I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Ashley Kinseth. Ashley S. Kinseth is an international human rights lawyer and recent founder of the nonprofit organization, the Stateless Dignity Project, which works to advocate for the safety and dignity of stateless groups around the world. Ms. Kinseth was living and working as a researcher in both Rakhine and Rohingya villages across the northern Rakhine state in the months leading up to the 2017 massacres. And she was overseeing village research in Mungdaw, which would become the very epicenter of the atrocities, just as the crisis began. Her work now focuses primarily on the 2017 Rohingya genocide and the statelessness and refugee issues, with particular emphasis on proving genocidal intent under international law. On these topics, Ms. Kinseth has published in the Washington Post, Al Jazeera, the Dhaka Tribune, and Oxford's Tea Circle, and has spoken at related conferences and events, including at the National Assembly in Paris and the University of Ottawa. She previously worked with various INGOs, including the UN Office on the Prevention of Genocide, the Carter Center, and the International Senior Lawyers Project. She obtained her law degree from Columbia Law School, her master's in human rights from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, and her individualized bachelor's from New York University. She is also the former editor-in-chief of the Columbia Human Rights Review, the top-ranked human rights legal journal in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, Ashley Kinseth.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to Bama for having me here, and thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm going to go ahead and start off, and perhaps the introduction stole a little of this thunder, but I'm going to start by addressing what's at least the elephant in my head, if not in the room, for some people, which is the obvious fact that I am a young white woman, and some people might wonder, what could she possibly know, or what could she possibly say, and understand this experience that would be helpful and meaningful to us. So as I was introduced, I am indeed an international human rights lawyer and increasingly a genocide lawyer. But what is, I think, I'm here essentially by sheer coincidence in a way because, and I certainly won't call it luck by any means, but last year I was working in Mongda and Butidong just as the crisis began. And I was there for most of the month of August, which I'll talk about for a bit. And I saw and heard many things that only, sadly, in retrospect, came to me as clear evidence of genocidal intent on the part of the Myanmar government. And it has been my passion and commitment ever since to work on behalf of the Rohingya people. So with that being said, I'm not going to speak too much legalese. I'm just going to talk very briefly about some of the legal components of genocide, and then focus really on genocidal intent and both my experiences, a bit about the proof we've seen in the media, and also about some of the survivor testimony that I heard in visiting the Bangladesh camps. So first of all, according to the UN Genocide Convention, it's contrary to popular belief. People seem to think that for something to be genocide, it needs to be the equivalent of the Holocaust, which is not at all the case. That's a popular belief among civilians, the average person, especially Americans, but it's not at all the case. Actually, there's simply 4 criteria. They must commit any of 5 genocidal acts, not all of them, but any. And as the UN recognized recently on the aforementioned report, fact-finding mission report, they found 4 genocidal acts, which is exactly what I stated myself last October in my Al Jazeera article. Second, it must be a group, and the Rohingya are clearly a group. It must be a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, and they clearly fit many of those definitions. And it must be an attempt to destroy in whole or in part the ethnic group. So I think those criteria are all very easily met, and they're usually not something that any government argues about. But the one thing that governments across the world, and especially the United States, love to use repeatedly and have done ever since the Holocaust ever since we said never again, is to deny that we can know what the intentions were of the government, that we can deny that there was true genocidal intent. It's the biggest cop-out that's ever used, and it's used repeatedly because countries seem to believe that by acknowledging, by using the G word, by saying genocide, it means they must intervene, which in a way is what the law indeed says. And they're afraid to do that in countries where they don't have personal interests or where they don't feel an affinity. For example, we intervened in Bosnia, but they were other white people, Europeans, who Americans say felt more akin to. And Americans are not very well aware of what's going on in the world. And so anyway, when we don't have personal interests, most of the world does not like to get involved. So that's why I think, well, another thing that I'll say is a reason that governments use this is because it is hardest to prove legally. It's a classical problem, actually, in law in general, in criminal law, to prove what's called mens rea, which basically means a guilty mind or a state of mind. So it is the hardest to prove, and that's why it's so easy for governments to say this and get away with it. That's why it makes it the most critical thing to advocacy work, both of me and of my organization, because we must convince the media to start recognizing this. We must convince the public to start using this word, and in turn, to place pressure on governments to use the word. And I'm very encouraged and heartened by Canada's use as the first major country to unanimously use the dreaded G word, and I really, really hope that they will continue to take the moral lead on this issue. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much. That's my dear friend from law school, so thank you. In any case, so let me start by just talking a little bit about some of this evidence of genocidal intent. I think a lot of us know about some of the reports, the major reports we've seen. For example, the Reuters investigation and the Fortify Rights reports, which gave some very, very clear evidence of genocidal premeditation. It's extremely hard to deny based on just that evidence alone. But if I'm to talk about my own experiences just briefly, I would say, well, I was first there in 2013 doing research in northern Rakhine State. And while I was there, things were not good, but when I went back in I was in Myanmar several times, but mostly in Yangon in between. And when I went back to live and work there in 2017 and lived there for approximately 7 to 8 months, things were much, much worse. It was noticeably worse in many regards. And there were a few particular experiences. I have too many to possibly state them all here, so I won't get into every one. But there were a few things that really stuck out to me, and in retrospect really plagued me and made me feel this deep need to search for more evidence of genocidal intent and to prove this. So one of the first things was the fact that it was increasingly hard for us to visit Rohingya villages, no matter where we were. I was a roving researcher, so I went all over northern Rakhine State. And closer to Sittwe, it was a bit easier, but the further north you went, I actually was not, in August when I was in Mongdo and Buridong, they no longer allowed any foreigners to access any Rohingya villages under any condition. Travel authorizations were not allowed. So I was no longer able to conduct my research in person, and instead trained teams. Can you hear me all right? Sorry. So instead I trained Rohingya teams to do this research. And I began to notice that they were coming back from their work very late every day, and was simply concerned as to why. So I eventually found out that this was because they were arriving at villages, and villagers were all in hiding, and they would have to find them in nearby forests and other areas to get them to come together for the scheduled meetings, because in general they were hearing of cases where, they were getting these Facebook messages, some of you may have seen them, but Facebook messages that were actually nearly identical for both Rohingya and Rakhine. So in my personal opinion, I do believe they may have been instigated by the Myanmar government itself. But they were receiving Facebook messages that suggested that the attacks were coming soon from the other side. Both sides were receiving messages that said attacks were coming, and Rohingya villagers in particular were scared and in hiding. In fact, even my own translator, who was the most brilliant, sweet, wonderful man, came to work frazzled and exhausted one day, one of those last days that I was there, because he had spent the night before sleeping in his paddy field in the middle of the monsoon, well, deep in the monsoon season, watching over his family as they slept, and yet he came to work the next day. And these were the things Rohingya villagers faced, and they came to work the next day and were excellent and incredible. And it's just amazing that what they were going through, and then to come to work like that. So that was one thing that I noticed. And then, sorry, let me just, one more thing that I'd mention from that experience was on my very last night in Mongda, which very coincidentally happened to be the night before the night that has become famous, August 25th. We were working at the staff house, and we heard and saw gunfire at a nearby security checkpoint, and we didn't know what it was, and it went on for a bit, and then it stopped, and we didn't know what had happened, and so we let it go, and we shouldn't have. We should have spoken more about this, and again, this is what has led me to investigate continually. So beyond that, I've heard a lot from acquaintances too, because I've sought out a lot of information about this, fellow field workers. And a lot of field workers are afraid to come forward. That's because most of them are humanitarian aid workers. For one, it can be dangerous for them, and it can be dangerous for their organizations, and to be no longer allowed to deliver aid or work in even northern Rakhine State, or even the country as a whole. And it can be dangerous for the individuals. So very few field workers are willing to come out and speak about this. But I, on the other hand, am a lawyer, and I think my organization may think twice before they ever hire a lawyer again for this kind of position. In any case, I did confidentially, anonymously learn from many of my acquaintances about some of their experiences and observations. And obviously one of the things they noticed, and we all noticed, was a major influx of national military personnel. And as we learned from the Reuters investigation, and this corroborates their findings, those were from the two of the most brutal infantry divisions at the national level. So people were aware and noticed that and concerned by it. And one of the most troubling things to me, although I will get to the very most troubling, but one of the very troubling things to me was that one of my colleagues on August 19th saw a truckload of crates of landmines arriving in Mongda town, right in Mongda town. And I think that's especially interesting because it's interesting and disturbing because landmines, that is no preparation for counterinsurgency. Landmines have no ability to distinguish between civilian and combatants, essentially. And their destructive capacity can last decades. So they're really designed to target fleeing civilians in this case, I believe. And there's no legitimate use, and that's why they're universally condemned, and in my opinion, essentially illegal under international law, which is a somewhat debatable matter, but I believe that they are by customary international law illegal. And they're universally condemned. They are absolutely abhorred. But finally, I would say that the most disturbing story I heard was most disturbing story of a premeditated evil that is just beyond belief to me, was a story I heard from a group of villagers when I visited the Rohingya camps. And that was from a group of villagers who also wished to remain anonymous, most of them, who lived in a village just south of Mongda and Budidong. And for about 45 days before August 25th, actually before August 27th, when their village was attacked, their village was enclosed with barbed wire all around it, and they couldn't enter or leave in any way. They had no access to food, no access to any basic needs whatsoever. And they eventually they were convinced they would starve to death. They told me literally, quote, "We were sure we would starve to death." And they resorted to eating leaves, and 2 people did die of starvation. And not only that, but repeatedly local vigilantes and the military personnel would not only harass them, beat them, come in and accuse them of things, but they lit their mosque on fire several times, 3 times actually, sometimes with people in them shooting in. They would throw rocks in at them, and then they would accuse the Rohingya villagers of setting their own mosque on fire for God knows why. But in any case, that was awful. And then, of course, they were subject to an attack, much like so many that we have heard of. The stories are almost terrifyingly identical in so many places, so I won't recap that, except to say that one of the people I spoke with who does wish to remain anonymous recalls vividly he said the only survivors were in the smoke, the weeds, and the water, and himself, he was in a fishing pond, and he remembers only having his nose and eyes above water and watching as his family and as all of his neighbors and fellow villagers were slaughtered and being absolutely unable to do anything about it. So that, to me, is not only an example of incredibly premeditated evil, but also one of the very disturbing stories that we've heard from, what happened last year. So that's from gathered survivor testimony. And I think that covers a few of my key points about, what I wanted to cover in terms of genocidal intent. But just to sum up with a few things, I think this kind of testimony, this personal sort of testimony, although no one thing is really major or the thing that sort of seals it or proves it. I think obviously the major in international investigations like Fortify, Reuters, also of course the UN fact-finding mission and Canada's findings, etc., are much more significant. But they're also important for field workers, people who were field workers, which I no longer am, but it's important for people who were there, who have an outside, supposedly, objective perspective, to come forward and state what they have seen and corroborate that evidence to help once again show, really, really dramatically that this is not the work of any biased group, which is a huge myth that continues to permeate Myanmar, as we all know. So I think it's really important for people to continue to come out. And unfortunately, again, most field workers are not willing to do that, sometimes for understandable reasons. So I would like to see that happen, and I really do hope to. I think personal testimony from outsiders is important in that way. We also have the UN General Assembly going on with the major week coming up. And I think we absolutely must work for other governments in Canada. Again, I hope we'll take the moral lead on this to recognize this as genocide, but it's extremely important that it be the UN Security Council members. And I think without that, because of the veto abilities of so many UN Security Council seats, 5 seats, and some of which I imagine would almost certainly veto intervention in Myanmar, it's quite critical for Security Council to acknowledge this issue. And unfortunately, I'm rather pessimistic, but I hope that some governments at least will take the lead in intervening and protecting the Rohingya people. And on that note, first of all, I'd like to say there's been a lot of talk about the ICC, but I think there's one thing that we all need to note, and that's that the International Criminal Court can try individuals, and Myanmar is not a party to the International Criminal Court statute, which means, Bangladesh is, so that means that they can only try for crimes committed on Bangladesh soil. And what that has come to mean is they can only try for what they're calling deportations. They can't try for the full range of crimes that we've seen within Myanmar's territory. So although it's a piece of justice, it's not complete justice, and it's also about individuals, it's not about the state. Whereas the International Court of Justice, on the other hand, or an independent tribunal, if established, could focus on the state and or individuals. Finally, the last thing that I would like to say is that, first of all, I recognize that my own ancestors have committed absolutely horrible crimes, from slavery to the genocide of Native Americans, to colonialism and carving up the world in ways that continue to create conflict across the world. And I do realize that I benefit from certain privileges as a result of that. But that also makes me feel a very strong need to do my best to elevate the voices of people who are in situations where they are not permitted or allowed or able to elevate their own voices. So to me, I don't want to speak for what should happen for the Rohingya. My only desire is to elevate the voices of the Rohingya people themselves. And with that in mind, protected return to the protected homeland is my highest priority. And all I will ever do, both me and my organization, is seek to elevate the voices of Rohingyas and their desires, and I hope that I can be of assistance in that. So thank you very much.